Ryan, and I am here to talk to you today about my paper, Tempest, Temporal Dynamics and Anonymity Systems, which I worked on with my friends Ishin Sun, Aaron Johnson, Meng Cheng, and Pratik Mittal at both the US Naval Research Lab and at Princeton. So as the title of this work suggests, we're looking at how time can affect anonymous communication systems, and in particular low latency anonymous communication systems like Tor. So over the past decade, there has been a lot of development in low latency anonymous communication systems. There have been lots of works that appeared at top venues, and we found that a lot of these works ignore time. And kind of as an example of this, you might see a new protocol appear, and in the security evaluation, they will simulate a client which makes a connection through a static network, a single connection. They will evaluate the anonymity of this connection, make some conclusion about security, and move on. But this isn't how systems work today. People don't make a single connection through Tor and then delete Tor off their laptop. So in our work, we looked at three real-world phenomena, which are time-based. We call them temporal dynamics. And these dynamics are often ignored and can impact system security. So the first is that clients can move over time. This is pretty simple. People use Tor on laptops and on cell phones. And we call this dynamic client mobility. Also, users are inclined to use these systems for long periods of time and may make many connections through these systems. And the third dynamic we identified is called routing changes, and it's just the observation that the internet path between any two hosts can change. So these are the three dynamics that we looked at, and we looked at how they interacted with a variety of systems. So in the top half of this table here, I have Tor and recent modifications to Tor, which were proposed to improve its security. And in the bottom half of this table, I have newer protocols which operate at the network layer as opposed to the application layer where Tor operates. And there are some ways that these dynamics, some limited prior work which analyze how these dynamics interact with these systems, but for the most part we found the space was relatively unexplored. So in our work, we identified a lot of attacks on these systems which leverage these dynamics. And this table is kind of packed, but what I want you to pick out is that for every row, every one of these systems is affected by at least one of these dynamics, and in every column, each one of these dynamics can be leveraged into an attack across both Tor-like protocols and these newer network layer protocols. So we think this is a serious issue and one that we should address. So to give you an example, there's too many systems to cover in this talk, but I'll give you an example of two of the dynamics and how they affect two of the systems. So I'm going to look at client mobility and how it affects Tor, and user behavior and how it affects a Tor-like protocol called DNASA. To give you a very brief background on Tor, clients make a connection through three Tor relays, a guard, middle, and exit. For each new circuit that a client builds, he will choose a new middle and exit relay, but a client will use a single guard for a long period of time, a couple months, although this rate might be accelerated if, say, the guard goes offline, the client may be forced to choose a new guard. And the other thing you need to know is that relays are selected with probability proportional to their bandwidth. So, I'll show you an example of this in a minute. Okay, so let's look at the first dynamic and see how it interacts with Tor. And let's start with me as an example. In my travel to PETS this year, I was using Tor. And the day of my flight, I started out and I connected from home, and I ran a trace route to see who could see the traffic to my Tor guard. And there were three networks: Verizon, a transit network called Tata, and then finally the AS of my guard, which was LeaseWeb. But then I started moving around. I connected to a coffee shop when I got coffee before my flight, and that allowed two more networks to see my client guard traffic. And this pattern continued. I connected from my phone, that added AT&T, etc. And by the time that I was done, and I had traveled to PETS, an additional 7 ASs saw my client guard traffic, which was a 3 times increase over when I was just connecting at home. And I had connected to Tor from 6 different networks. So my claim is that this is a bad thing. This weakens security. And in particular, I'm worried about a passive adversary here who controls a single AS. This is a very common adversary model in Tor research. And the adversary's goal here is to observe client guard traffic. He would do this, for instance, if he's interested in running traffic correlation attacks or website fingerprinting attacks. This is the place where he wants to be. Okay, so the questions we wanted to answer in this analysis were, how mobile can some clients be, and does this mobility weaken system security? So we really wanted a data set of how Tor users move around. But there is no such data set. If you have one, you're kind of in big trouble. You should probably leave. So we did find data sets about how people moved. And in particular, we looked at two publicly available data sets about how users moved in these social networks, Foursquare and Gowalla. So each of these data sets contained location traces for a few 100,000 users over a period of about 1.5 years. And we had check-in histories for these users. So we knew at certain times they checked into certain countries. We knew which countries they visited, more or less. And so we looked at, in both data sets, how many distinct countries did these users visit. So the top half of the table shows users with distinct country movements, like how many there were. And in both cases, we found that in about 25% of users had at least visited 2 distinct countries, and there were travelers who visited more countries than that. And on the bottom half of the table shows the first quartile of how fast the users moved around. So in the 2 column and the Q1 days, that says that for 25% of the Gowalla users, they visited 2 countries in 7 days or less. And so we find that some of the users in our data set, not a small fraction, both were willing to travel to many countries and traveled very quickly. In less than a few months, some people visited more than 6 or 7 countries. So we made a conservative assumption then and said, we don't really know where these users are connecting from, but let's just assume that they connect from the top Tor client ASs from each country. We used an existing data set, the Join data set, to determine which Tor ASs were popular. And then we looked at the probability that one of the largest 50 ASs on the internet can compromise the client guard link. Okay, so let's look at some data then. So how to read this graph. The y-axis shows the probability that if I'm the average top 50 AS in the internet, one of the average largest 50 AS in the internet, the probability that I compromise the median user are the points in the graph, and then the shaded region is the distribution over all users. It shows the range over all users. So the bottom left point at 1 and then 0.3 says that if I'm the average top 50 AS in the internet, and the user didn't move around, they stayed in one country for the entire time which we had data, then the probability that it compromised them is about 3%. As they start moving, that probability increases. Once they have visited 3 distinct countries, the probability doubles in both of our data sets. And for some of the most, for the users who travel the most, we found that the probability can increase 9 to 10 times. So the risk for these users would be underestimated by almost an order of magnitude if you didn't consider mobility. Okay, so that is client mobility and how it can interact with Tor. What I just want you to take away is that many clients are mobile today, and that mobility can reduce system security. To look at maybe a more involved example of a dynamic, we can look at user behavior and how it affects a system called DNASA. So DNASA has an algorithm called gselect, and the gselect algorithm is pretty simple. It just says, don't select guards where one of 2 ASs is on the client guard link. So that is AS1299, which is Talia network, and AS3356, which is level 3. So how this looks like then is if I'm a client and I have 3 guards to choose from, maybe they have 3 different probabilities. The first 2 have probability 1/4, and the third has probability 1/2. If AS1299 is on the client guard link, I will reweight the relays accordingly so that I won't choose G1 anymore, but I'll choose G2 and G3 with the same relative probabilities. But this leaks some information. So if there is a second client who has a different set of links to these guards, the observation here is that G3 is chosen by these two clients with differing probabilities. The client in AS44 chooses G3 with probability 2/3, whereas the client in AS88 is choosing G3 with probability 1. And what this means is, if I'm a middle relay and I see G3 on my circuit, well, I don't know where the client's coming from because that's a general protection that Tor provides, but I have gained a little information. If I condition on G3, I now know that it's a little more likely that the client is coming from AS88 than it is that the client is coming from AS44. But that observation itself is not novel. Our contribution is that this leak can get very bad over time. So in particular, if the adversary is able to observe many guards for a client, then the adversary can effectively learn the client's location. So how can an adversary learn many guards for a user? Well, we're going to consider an adversary who runs a destination and some relays. We can consider like a cloud service provider like OVH to be such an adversary. And he's going to be a passive adversary, and his goal is going to be to learn the client AS. Okay, so to see what this looks like, let's consider a destination which is like a pseudonymous form where a user can post under a pseudonym. And the user is going to use Tor to protect his identity, his real identity, but again, the adversary is going to run some middle relays and also is running the destination as like the cloud service provider. So on day one, the client connects to the destination through Tor, maybe makes a post. On day two, he does so again, but chooses the adversarial middle relay in this case. He runs a traffic correlation attack, and using his observation of the circuit, he now learns that the client is using G1, this pseudonymous client. On day three, his guard goes down. He chooses a different guard, makes a connection through the exit. On day four, he chooses the adversarial middle relay again, and now has learned, again using traffic correlation, that the client is using G3. Okay, so two things to note at this point. This is one guard discovery attack. This is like the predecessor attack, but there are others. There's the throughput fingerprinting attack. Florentine just presented a guard discovery attack, and the adversary can use any of these. And also, the adversary can get clever about how he's linking client connections. For example, he could be looking at an SSH server and sees that only one client ever connects at 5 p.m. every day. And that might be the way that he links together these connections. So once he's made these observations, he can compute a posterior distribution over where he thinks that the client is coming from. So to evaluate this attack, we looked at all 60, or we gave the adversary no prior information about where the client's coming from. We just assumed that the client is coming from one of 60,000 ASs on the internet. We looked for some leaky client ASs using some heuristics. We identified 10 of them. And then we simulated a client making connections out of these ASs for up to 6 guard selections. We repeated this procedure 100 times for each client AS, and then we looked at the average posterior entropy of the adversary's location distribution over client locations. So this is the plot of that. And in the top left, the adversary starts out with like 15.5 bits of entropy. But as time goes on, entropy decreases dramatically. So you see that after one guard observation, the client loses some bits of entropy. But after two observed guards, the adversary can effectively learn the client's location in most of the ASs we looked at, which is really bad. So what I want you to take away is that these small leaks can become significant over time, and that it's also important to consider the worst case here, because some of these clients might be in these ASs and they might really need the protection that Tor provides. And so we want to not have any of these worst case ASs where you might not know if you're in one. And we don't want to erode trust in the network by having these degenerate cases. So in conclusion, there are a lot of systems we looked at in this paper. I presented 2 of the attacks and 2 of the systems, but I hope that if your system is up here, you take a look at what we did. And we don't think that these systems are totally broken. So I think there's promising research in addressing these dynamics explicitly. We also want to motivate researchers to consider the long-lived adversary, one who is interested in aggregating data about users and de-anonymizing users over time. And also, we think that the research community in general could use better tools in both evaluating these systems over time and also in formalizing the security that these systems can provide over time. Okay, so that's my talk. Aaron and Pratik are both here, and if you're interested in this kind of thing, you should also talk to them. Thank you.
Questions?
Hey, thanks for your talk. Great. There is a model that has driven Tor security since years, which is that being compromised once is as bad as being always compromised. And do you think that this model makes also sense for people that travels a lot?
Wait, can you repeat the first part of your question?
So there is a model that that has driven Tor research security, and this model says that being compromised only once is as bad as being always compromised. And my question is, do you think that this model makes sense for people that travel a lot?
So, yeah, I think it depends on the adversary that you're considering. And it also depends on user behavior. So if my behavior is very repeated, then like being de-anonymized once, like being de-anonymized down to my pseudonym is as bad as being de-anonymized forever, right? Because once someone can associate me with my pseudonym, then I lose. But again, it depends on what you're doing. I think it really depends on like the user model and the adversary model that you have. Thanks.
So nice work. In the part about attacking Tor, you were using an average of the compromise rates over top 50 ASs. And so in our work in NASA, of course, we found that, well, really, it's just the top few ASs, by some definition of top, are responsible for like a huge amount of the potential compromises in Tor.
Sure.
So did like this average of the top 50 is actually quite a conservative metric, I would guess. Did you find that in the data?
Yeah, I think we looked at top 50 because we didn't want to make assumptions about the exit destination link, which I think is where the suspect ASs in DNASA came from, right? Those are the most likely to be on both sides of the circuit.
Both sides of the circuit, yeah.
But we didn't want to make any assumptions about what the users were doing. So we just kind of assumed that the top 50 ASs were the ones that were probably most likely on the other side of the link, but we didn't want to make any assumptions about like if they were visiting Alexa sites or not, anything like that.
But just in terms of, I mean, when you look at the data that you had, like you probably had, here's all 50 of them, did you find that some were like really, really responsible for a lot of compromises, or?
I don't know if we looked at probability rates for individual ASs, more than just a handful, and I think they were similar. The largest ones were somewhat similar to the ones that we're presenting.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for the talk. On one of the slides showing the second example, you spoke about leaky locations.
Yes.
What does this mean, or could you give an example about this?
Yeah, so the ASs that we finally evaluated, the leaky ones are the ones which lose entropy over time very quickly. So these are the leaky ASs. We found 10 of them. We showed 4 of them here. The other 6 were very similar to these. But those were the ones, we just used heuristics to search through the space to find ones that leaked information very quickly.
Last question, anyone? Ian?
Could you identify like what caused them to be especially leaky? Are they highly connected or poorly connected?
Yeah, so I think many of these are highly connected with Talia, and so most of their traffic went through Talia, but there were a few guards which they didn't route, they only had very few guards to choose from. So when they chose those guards, it was they chose them with much higher probability than any of the other ASs. So when they chose those guards repeatedly, then it was very obvious that those guard selections corresponded to clients in those ASs.
Right. Okay, thanks for hearing.
Thanks.
Okay, so next session is on tracking in half an hour. Is Narceo here? Session chair for next one? Okay. No? Okay, please try to find your session chair. See you in half an hour.